Even though watches now feel a lot less practical than they once did, it's estimated that around 1.3 billion watches are still made every year. Of course, they've now become a little bit more of a status symbol, and the industry in total has actually been estimated to be worth around 30 billion US dollars each year. Of course, Switzerland is known as the center of luxury timepieces, even though the first wristwatch is actually credited to being made in Germany around 500 years ago, around the year 1500. However, watchmaking was known in Geneva shortly after, and in fact, it became really popular there because wearing jewelry at the time in Switzerland was actually outlawed. And so all of the jewelers in Geneva started looking to watches in order to stay in business. If you've been browsing for watches either online or in person, you've probably noticed one major difference, and that's that they're either labeled as quartz or mechanical. And there tends to be a large price difference between the two. When it comes to mechanical watches, they're usually labeled as automatic or manual, and this is just describing how the movement has to be wound within the watch. The most expensive of the two is definitely the mechanical movement. And for the first 400 years or so, that was really all that was available in the timepiece market. Now mechanical movements are definitely considered a specialty item, and they really only account for around 1% of the entire industry. Now most mechanical movements are automatic, which means that the mainspring, which is winding the entire movement within the watch, is being automatically wound by oscillation, which means that it gets its power from the movement of the wearer. Of course, originally the movements were manual, which means the person who was wearing the watch had to actually manually wind the mainspring of the movement themselves. The mainspring is really the heart of the watch. It's what's keeping the entire movement and the whole thing going. As it unwinds, it's giving the power of the movement to each individual gear within the watch. And each of those gears controls something that has to be wound within the timepiece. So there's one for hours, minutes, and if there's a second hand or any other complications within the watch, such as the date or day of the week or any. Just like any other mechanical contraption that requires gears, you also need bearings so that those gears don't completely wear down over time and essentially the timepiece will stop working. In fact, most timepieces actually use gemstones as bearings to help absorb the friction of the gears and in general just prolong the life of the watch and make sure that it continues to keep time and run smoothly. Most of the jewels used within the watches now are lab-grown corundum, also known as sapphire. This, of course, is the same material that's used as the crystal, also known as the face of the watch, because, of course, corundum is much harder than glass, and you're going to be with a lot less scratches and damage to the face of your watch. The amount of gems will vary within each movement, but this is why you'll see something that's called like a 17 jewel movement, which is pretty standard within the industry. Now, while that mainspring is unwinding within the watch and powering those gears, it also requires a little regulating system, and this helps balance that mainspring and make sure that it stays kind of doing its job and not absorbing too much pressure or getting off balance. And within the regulating system, there are four main mechanisms, which are the balance spring, the balance wheel, the escapement lever, and the escape wheel. Of course, these parts are very intricate and they require master watchmakers in order to ensure that everything is winding smoothly and keeping balance so that your very expensive timepiece is, of course, keeping as accurate time as possible. And this is why you'll often see a lot of luxury watches with beautiful exhibition backs so that you can see all of those little parts and all of the work that has gone into that beautiful timepiece. Again, these automatic mechanical watches are using a combination of gravity and the momentum of the movement of the wearer while you're wearing the watch in order to keep that mainspring operating as it should. So when you're not wearing your mechanical watch, it's important to keep it in a winder so that you can make sure that it keeps its time and it's not stopping and starting, which can really mess with the whole timepiece itself. Of course, this makes mechanical watches feel a lot more high maintenance than your average watch. You really need to think about if this is something that fits into your lifestyle, if you're the type of person to even wear a watch every day or want to wear the same watch, and you have to have a plan for traveling and when you want to store the watch, when you're not going to wear it, etc. So you do have to put some thought into it, and of course the price points of these pieces, you really want to make sure that you're going to take care of it long term, and if it's not for you, you may want to consider a quartz powered watch, which is definitely a lot less high maintenance. Quartz watches were introduced to the public until 1969, and the first one for sale was actually offered by Seiko. Quartz watches actually need electricity to be powered, and as mentioned, they're not considered the most luxurious timepieces, and they're definitely lower in price point, but ironically, they definitely tend to keep the most accurate time. Now, these watches can either use solar power or battery power in order to get their electric energy, and they actually also use a gemstone in order to be powered, and they use a lab-grown quartz, and quartz again is the same mineral that we see with amethyst and citrine. The electric current that the watch receives, again, either from the sun or from the battery, helps the quartz vibrate at a very high frequency, over 30,000 times per second. And it's this very consistent and high-powered vibration that makes a quartz watch so accurate over long periods of time. This current is passed through a tiny motor, and it's the motor that helps move the hands and the gears within the movement of the watch. Of course, if you have a digital watch, it's the same thing that powers the liquid crystal display. That's the only downside with quartz watches is that they do tend to be battery powered, and so of course you do need to replace the battery from time to time, although these days it's not very often, usually only once every couple of years, and this tends to be a very inexpensive process as well. Some other things that you might see when shopping for a very high-end watch is a chronograph, and this just means that it's generally referring to a stopwatch complication that the watch has so that you can measure elapsed time, and it's showing on the face of the watch. Some other parts of the watch that you may want to know while shopping or browsing online is that the entire case is the piece that holds all of the movements in the complication for the watch. And as I mentioned, you may have an exhibition back there where it shows you the parts of the manual movement. The thicker the case is, the more complicated the movements tend to be. Then you have the bezel, which is the frame that really surrounds the entire face or crystal of the watch. And again, the crystal is referring to the lab-grown sapphire instead of glass. Then you have the crown of the watch, which is the lever on the side. And if you have a chronograph, for example, you may have multiple levers that are helping you control those movements. And of course, with some models, you may have a decorative crown, like for example, a blue lab-grown sapphire crown. And you see that with bezels as well. Of course, with items like Rolex, they're famous for their fluting, what they call their coin edge bezel. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to list them in the comments below, and visit us on our main page at winstongemsandjewellery.com.